Not too long ago, I covered the wreck of USS Strong. This destroyer was almost completely destroyed after she was sunk by a torpedo. A torpedo that may have been the longest range hit in history. Today's video will look at the ship that fired it, the Akizuki-class destroyer Niizuki, which went down the next night. Her wreck is more intact than Strong's, although pretty beat up in its own right. One of her turrets, in particular, is very interesting in how it ended up. Not to mention that the ship's mast is still strong and upright, which is very rare on any wreck, especially one this beaten up. However, that's for later. First, I'll briefly cover her sinking, as I always do. It should be noted, however, that there are no confirmed pictures of Niizuki, so I'll be using other Akizuki-class destroyers for example purposes. Now, let's get into it. On the night of July 5th, 1943, Niizuki was leading a troop transport run. Her luck would be nowhere near as good as when she sank Strong. The destroyer's radar sighted American ships, which prompted her commander, Rear Admiral Akiyama, to prepare for combat. As a result, Niizuki, Suzukaze, and Tanikaze swung to port and launched torpedoes. Niizuki probably fired hers here, judging from the wreck, but information on her final action is sparse. Regardless, after launching the torpedoes at roughly 11:52, Niizuki reported the American ships were intercepting her course. At 11:56 p.m. on July 5th, those ships opened fire, concentrating most of it on Niizuki, with predictable results. Thus began the Battle of Kula Gulf. The American formation consisted of 3 light cruisers, Honolulu, St. Louis, and Helena. That was a lot of very fast-firing 6-inch guns. The 4 destroyers added a bunch of 5-inch guns as well, which also fired on Niizuki. The combination of this fire set raging fires on the destroyer and completely obliterated her bridge. Understandably, the ship drifted out of formation, while the lighter damaged Suzukaze and Tanikaze pulled away. By 12:11 a.m. on July 6th, Niizuki had restored steering, presumably from the aft control station. This allowed the destroyer to work up to 26 knots and try to rejoin the other Japanese ships. However, more American shell fire zoned in on her and crippled the destroyer. Niizuki drifted to a halt, blazing from stem to stern. Sometime between those final shells and 3:15 a.m., Niizuki sank. Exactly when is an open question. A commonly accepted time is between 12:30 to 1 a.m., and we know it was before 3:15 because that's when the destroyer Amagiri went looking for survivors, and found no sign of the burning Niizuki. There were survivors in the water, but Amagiri spotted American destroyers rescuing survivors from USS Helena. This prompted the Japanese to abandon their rescue operation, leaving Niizuki's crew to their fate. Another destroyer, Mochizuki, fired on the American ships at around 4 a.m., but made no attempt to rescue Niizuki's men. Around 290 officers and sailors were lost with Niizuki. Japanese records being what they are, we can't say for sure if Amagiri picked up any survivors. Some of the crew might have made it ashore and joined Japanese forces on New Georgia, but if that happened, it was only a handful. Either way, Niizuki left the history books at this point, at least until fairly recently. In fact, her wreck would only be located in early 2019 on one of the last expeditions by RV Petrel. They found the wreck at a depth of 745 meters, or 2,444 feet. Among a spree of other discoveries that year, Niizuki tends to fall a bit in the shadows. This is a shame because her wreck has some very interesting details to it. There isn't any sonar to look at though, so let's move straight to the wreck. I'll begin with the weaponry and then move to the hull, starting here with one of the main battery turrets. Niizuki carried 4 such mounts, each holding 2 10-centimeter guns. There was a pair superfiring on the bow and a pair on the stern. I'm not sure exactly which one this is. I know it's not the number 3 turret simply because we see that later on. The same goes for the number 2 turret. So, by process of elimination, This is either the foremost mount, number 1, or the aftmost mount, number 4. The back has rusted out pretty badly, and it looks like there's a large shell hole. You can see the shape of the turret, as well as glimpse inside at the internal mechanism. That's easier to see here from closer in, although much of the detail is still hard to make out. From there, we move on to the number 3 turret. This begins from the front, where the barrels are both laying flat, although they may be pointing down, as we'll see in another picture. For this one, we can see what looks like a mostly intact turret. It's covered in sea life, and the hull at its base has rusted away. But the barrels, rust and incrustation aside, are still there, as is most of the turret face. Things get less pretty when you look at the rest of the turret. In a break from the usual wrecks, we have a 3D model here. And it's here where you can see the ravages of time, and probably some battle damage, in stark detail. The side here is completely gone, aside from some of the internal framework. This doesn't get much better towards the back. The rusted outside continues, as seen here. This is what confirms that the last turret wasn't turret 3. You can clearly see the difference in damage on the back. As for the top of it, that is much better. There is some damage, probably from corrosion, or 5-inch shell fire in a couple cases. In spite of that, most of the top is intact, even the siding hood behind the photobombing fish. As for the next picture, it moves a bit further back. Here we have the same turret, with more visible debris inside it. It's hard to say exactly what that debris is, but clearly the internals of the turret are wrecked, either from gunfire or simply the passage of time. The same goes for the hull beneath it. I'll put an arrow to where that is. This part of the ship is in pretty rough shape. That aside, while it's hard to see in the darkness, you can also spot the number 4 turret in the background. Both of these are angled out to starboard, where they were left in a final attempt to engage the American forces. The next picture for its part might be the number 4 turret. There's no real context clues to be sure, but it follows along after the previous image. In any case, it's another shot from further out. The gun barrels are trained over the side of the ship, with some damage visible here and here. At least from this angle, though, the turret is remarkably intact. The extreme rusting on the other two isn't here. That doesn't mean it isn't bad on the reverse side, but at least from this angle, we can see a more intact gunhouse. Without much else to say here, let's move to the bow turrets, or rather, what's left of them. There's only one image here from slightly different angles, unless the turret we started with was turret 1. This picture is also quite different from the usual, because, as you can see, we have the number 2 turret sitting on its side, still on the ship, in more or less the original position, but blown off its mounting and on its side. The force necessary to do that is, on its own, impressive. The more impressive thing is that this remained on the ship instead of just falling off entirely. It is, after all, resting on the very edge of the deck. Clearly, Niizuki sank on more or less an even keel. If she had listed at all, let alone capsized, that would have fallen off. Unless the turret ended up that way from the impact with the bottom, which, I grant you, is a possibility. Regardless, the turret is in decent enough shape, considering its orientation. The barrels are still in place, and the overall shape is still there. More holes are present in the top, although this looks more like rusting than shell fire. The other turret, meanwhile, is harder to make out. Until, that is, Petrel brought their ROV in closer. It's still shrouded in darkness for the most part, but you can at least see more of it here. And from this angle, it's mostly intact, although the barrels from turret 2 are resting either right in front of it or on top of it. The angle makes it hard to say for sure. That wraps up the main battery, so let's move to the torpedoes. There's also only one picture here, which is a bit of a mess with the mount wrecked on top. But, wrecked top or not, the mount is intact. It didn't explode or fall off. In fact, it seems to be in reload position. Between that and the mostly intact mount, it says three things. One, that Niizuki got off a volley of torpedoes. Secondly, that she didn't have time to reload and fire again. And finally, that she wasn't hit hard in this area. Long lances can and will explode from battle damage, but that didn't happen here. With that done, that just leaves the 25mm guns. There are a couple pictures here where the guns are sitting all on their own. The platform and superstructure around them is gone, while the weapons remain. There's not much to make out, however. There might be a boat davit here, but the 25mm mount itself is completely covered. You can't even make out the individual barrels. This doesn't get much better further out, other than the fact you can see another mount in the background. So, with the weaponry done, it's time for the hull, beginning here with the very tip of the bow. It only shows a little bit, but at least here, things are in decent shape. The railing is still intact, and the shape of the bow is still there, as is a lot of rust in real color without any blue tint. Things don't look as good when you move further back. This part of the hull, which I believe is near the bow, is broken up. There's a lot of debris scattered about, including wiring draped over the side, and it looks like it broke apart right here. With this amount of damage and debris, it's hard to say for sure where this is or what it was. And things get even more broken in the next picture. This is a very large buckling in the hull, with the side torn open and the deck thrust upward. This is, evidently, around the starboard bow. This kind of damage was most likely caused by a massive explosion. We know that Niizuki was engaged by American destroyers, although we don't know how she ultimately sank. A torpedo hit, or multiple hits, is fairly likely. This damage could be from torpedoes. It could also, admittedly, be from an internal explosion. Either way, the notable thing here is how high the deck is buckled. In the next picture, it moves a bit lower. The frames of Niizuki are visible here because much of the side plating is gone. It also looks like the hull is sagging right here. Whatever caused this damage, it did a number on the destroyer. You can even see some of the side plating here that's fallen down. Still attached, barely, but almost completely gone. The situation does not get any better with the bridge, or rather, what little is left of it. As you can see, most of the superstructure is collapsed and gone. Reports of the battle indicate that Niizuki's bridge was hit hard and early. The damage supports that because it's been shot away, and crushed for that matter. There's almost nothing recognizable here, and it even looks like the hull is buckled up in the background. Alternatively, the bridge is pushed down at an angle. One look closer in shows what looks like the wheel, crushed beneath the collapsed bridge and buried in scattered debris. This stands as testimony to how bad Niizuki was hit. And yet, despite all this damage, Niizuki is one of the rare ships to have an upright mast. This stands proud and tall over the ruined ship to this day. Somehow, it wasn't shot away or broken off during the sinking. The top of the mast even looks like it has some of the radar left. Not much, but if any of that survived, it's almost a miracle. The mast being there qualifies as a miracle too, I think. Ships in much better condition have lost those. That said, we're coming up on the end of the video now. Just 2 pictures left, both of the stern. First, the propeller, or screw, almost completely buried in the mud. This shows that Niizuki, as a whole, is buried pretty deep, almost to the waterline. It does mean there's not much to see here. The one blade poking out is in decent enough shape, as is the mounting. There's no apparent damage here, which would match with the crew regaining control of the ship. Now for the last picture. This is the extreme stern of the destroyer, which looks mostly intact towards the bottom. There's no notable shell holes, and the only real damage looks like rust damage here. Above a certain point, however, everything is gone. Nothing but twisted metal and ruined debris. A reminder that, while some parts of Niizuki are in good condition, this ship was still shot to pieces. She went down fighting, and bears the scars of that to this day. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.